Item 16, and over to you, Phil, again.
Brendan will explain the details in this report, but like what the committee worked through, and it was particularly following a workshop with stakeholders, and it was certainly a form of engagement across the community, really. But some of the changes that are being recommended by the committee are that the frequency of the grant funding, that be changed, increased, so that they're quarterly now. And the other part too, though, is asking council to allow any unallocated money from the HIG to actually be, the heritage incentive grants, to actually be carried over to another year. A really great feature in the report is that finally there's the Woods Mill. It's quite clear that they're really progressing well. That's and I think the staff for their perseverance with that whole story, really, of the Woods Mill in Addington, which is coming on in terms of its restoration. I think what's important, though, is that the heritage funding for the council-owned heritage buildings, that's gone out as a separate consultation. That's really a separate part from this report. But I think it's important that councillors are aware that in terms of heritage grant funding, we don't have any funding in the LTP for the Central City landmark heritage grants. And also there is no current funding for the Arts Centre grant, and previously as a council we have always had that. So that's something, and clearly there's a lot of public interest in that, or there will be. I think it's already the public already aware, for example, that the Arts Centre would like to upgrade, well, I guess redevelop really the observatory building, that part of the Arts Centre. So and it is clear in the report too that there's parts of work that have been done is that there's increased accessibility, I guess, to the heritage buildings now. There's an opportunity for that, allowing that public visibility of the good work which can be done through the heritage grants. And when people drive down Durham Street, I think St Michael's is an example where previously it was a old corrugated iron fence, and now there's nice railing so you can see through to the heritage part. So now there's only one thing I will perhaps ask that we note, and I have discussed this with Brendan. In the review, we didn't really fully consider aspects of Maori heritage, and Brendan assures me that in fact that is a part which is still to come. But perhaps if today we make a note that we're expecting that in due course.
And just to clear that last point about Maori and intangible heritage, that there is a body of work which is underway at the moment in partnership with Ngāi Tahu, and it's the Future of Heritage strategy. Now, we don't want to predetermine any outcomes from that piece of work, and that will include an emphasis and an understanding of Maori heritage. So that is definitely underway. It's just it's quite a difficult piece of work. We have to establish thresholds. It's quite simple for the buildings within Christchurch because you've got the threshold established by the district plan listing. We haven't got that sort of threshold for Maori heritage. So that's just one aspect that we have to explore, work through with Ngāi Tahu, and that is underway.
That's great. Thank you. So you want to move this?
I'll move that.
Phil?
Just so we're clear that it is coming, we make a brief note that
A second? Okay. And do you want to second it, Glenn? Okay. Sarah?
Thank you. I'm just looking at 7.7 in the report with the under and over allocation of funds from year to year depending on demand and the potential for the carryover. What has been, so in the years that it hasn't carried over because it hasn't been able to, what has been the lost sort of funding going into heritage at that point? Has it been very much money?
It's been in the thousands, excuse me, in the thousands of dollars, yeah. So
that we haven't spent.
Yeah, it's not been huge, but when we came out from in the immediate aftermath of the earthquakes, there was a lot of uncertainty, and the fund was allowed to accumulate. That allowed us to actually, when that pickup occurred in repairs, we were able to allocate funds from the previous years, and that saved a lot of buildings. What we're asking for here is that with the fund is actually declining, both in real terms and in terms of inflation, because construction inflation is in the manner of between 5 and 10% per annum. Now that may decline, but that's historically what we've had, and the actual physical pot of money has been going down. So in order to maintain the kind of results that we've been getting, we need to just make sure that we're taking every opportunity to put as much money into heritage as we can, rather than just because we couldn't allocate it one year to not allow us to then say, okay, well, we'll put that across into next year's fund.
But it'd be fair to say that the environment that we're working in now with buildings is quite different to that post-quake period.
There are still a lot of buildings.
There are still some that are getting repairs, but it's back to more of the BAU.
Well, no, what we're finding actually is that there are a lot of people now coming out of disputes with insurance companies. They've finally managed to resolve their insurance issues, and they're now ready to move forward into the repair phase. But we can't offer them as much funding assistance anymore, even though there will be gaps, because insurance will only cover you for a certain amount.
That's right, but there's no obligation on council to fund heritage, is there?
No.
It's just something we choose to do because we value heritage, but it's something we choose to put the funding in. We're not obliged to in any way.
Mike?
Thank you. I've noticed in the report now, in the policy, it now goes into actually that repairs aren't covered by for items that were covered originally by insurance or EQC payouts, which is really good to see. But then in 7.10, I'll just scroll up to, it talks about as-is, whereas houses and how they're covered. So I have a slight issue because the majority of these as-is, whereas houses, the actual property were insured, potentially for indemnity. They were paid out to the owner to repair that work, and they've just taken the money and sold it. So technically there was EQC money or insurance money to actually do the work. So on one hand we're saying we're not going to pay out people where there was EQC money to do it, but in 7.10 we're saying, well, we are going to pay you out if the owner did a runner. It's just...
What we're actually saying there is that we can't do anything about people who take their insurance settlement and then don't use it to actually repair the building. That's a private contractual agreement between them and their insurance company. What we're saying here is if somebody chooses to do that, walks away with a pot of money, they do very well out of it, but they leave the building behind. The building is still a heritage building with heritage values. We shouldn't abandon that building just because they've walked off with the money.
Yeah, but a lot of times when they'll be buying that building, they'll be buying it at a price that actually reflects that there was insurance money put in there, reflects the fact that the work hasn't been done. So technically they could potentially be buying it with that insurance money sort of negotiated into that price of contract.
And we would seek clarification on that, but I haven't had an example yet where the insurance money comes with the sale of the...
No, it won't come with the sale, but what it is the price of the contract will be actually a lot more reduced because of the fact that it's as-is, whereas, because it takes into the fact that obviously it's not insured and they've taken the money and not done the work. So technically, they've already sort of been given the money, just by the fact that they're paying a lower price.
But they've still got the work and the risk of the work. It's as if they were starting in a situation where they had no insurance and they were the owners of a building that needs work on it. So we don't see that there's a difference between that situation and somebody who's owned a building for a number of years.
Do you know how many as-is, whereas houses we've done grants for?
Not tremendous number. I can't tell you off the top of my head what numbers there are.
And
often
curious, and you might not know the answer to this one as well, but how many of them, like someone's come along and bought it, then applied for a grant, done the work? Do you know if any of them have just then been on-sold?
Not very many, very few.
But some have.
I'd have to check that and find that out. But I don't recall too many being sold.
Okay. Sorry, last question. Just looking at last year's funding, there was a couple of quite substantial grants of 200,000 or more. And obviously, the bigger the grants are, the less money there will be to spread out to other applicants, and so therefore the number we get is actually quite low for the year, which has concerned me quite a bit when we're looking potentially at one individual getting quite a large sum of money. So I'm just concerned that we don't put a cap on it, and potentially we can be giving these $200,000 plus grants to these individuals. How often, like last year there was 2 there plus 135. In previous years, how often has that been the case where we're getting these quite large sums of large grants?
Well, you can look back. I provide you with a 6-monthly
Sorry,
report.
but do you have a rough idea off the top of your head?
The reason that there will be larger grants is that we're not just looking at residential buildings. We're looking at quite a variety of buildings. We're looking at very large-scale commercial buildings.
Okay, so the vicarage is not a...
The vicarage is it's an unusual on that one because they had to physically move the building, so it's a very expensive fix.
Yeah, but it's a residential building.
It's a residential building.
So we gave one resident 204,000.
Yeah, but that was, as I say, that came through.
No, thank you.
Came through council.
Can I just move an amendment? Thanks.
Yep. Yeah.
That the Heritage Incentive Grants has a cap per grant of 150,000.
Don't put it there, put it underneath as a separate amendment, because unless Clearwater and Livingston want to agree to include that, I mean, I wouldn't support that.
No,
not without a report. I wouldn't mind that we got some further advice, but I wouldn't support just such a significant change just being agreed to without any advice.
Not at all. The committee of a delegation, I think it's up to 100,000, but the others come to council, and in fact, you know, some buildings are significant and large.
No, I'm not going to take a debate on the subject, but right, you're not agreeing to include it in the resolution. So could we have it as an amendment that future heritage incentive grants have a cap of $150,000? So it's moved by Councillor Davidson. So do I have a seconder for that, Sarah?
That would mean that all of the delegation would go to the committee, which would be great, because it means that they could make all of the decisions and not have to come back to council, because currently the delegation's up to 150,000.
This caps all heritage incentive grants.
Yeah, but currently the delegation to the committee is that they can make the decisions without coming to council if it's up to 150,000.
No, 100.
No, it was increased to 150.
150.
Oh, was it increased to 150?
Absolutely.
So we're delegating all the decisions, but as a council, we can't consider anything more. All right. Well, okay. So
the committee gets the full delegations.
Well, no. That's. I mean, it's not an appropriate. I mean. Can you ask a question of staff that might assist?
Well, except, like, I just wondered whether for residential, so if we were to support this amendment referring only to residential, what impact that would have in terms of the grants that we've given previously?
Yeah. Well, each case is individual, but there are some very substantial residential buildings that would require potentially a larger grant. What we're doing by not having a cap, we're retaining the flexibility so that your decisions can be you can make the decision on the grant. So we're not trying to restrict the grants in a way that could reduce their effectiveness.
Sorry, I guess the reason I'm really interested is it seems to me that we've got huge financial pressure on to fix heritage buildings, and so we just getting asked for more and more grants with a limited amount of funding. Yep. So I was really trying to understand if having this cap If it was, I can understand that like non-residential, there'll be some really significant buildings that you might want to give more than that. But for residential, it would seem to me that would this enable us to give more funding and support to heritage items in our city, because we're not giving these huge grants to residential, which would be pretty unlikely.
Can I just add that one of the improvements or changes, let's call it an improvement to the guidelines, is that the percentage of amount funded now, there's a clear statement about much more flexibility in that. So I think it's important to understand that when the staff are making the recommendations, and again when the committee are considering what the information that's put forward, that clear statement now provides I guess a range of options to be considered by the committee and by council, and then it becomes your decision, the committee or your decision.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that, but what I also understand or realise from the applicants that we get is that people will ask for as much as possible, and you know, there can be lots of reasons why that they should get that support from a heritage point of view, but from a budget point of view, it becomes quite difficult to make sure that we're spreading it out.
Well, we do actually make. Well, one of the things that is happening is the quarterly an assessment of each individual grant, so that you, instead of having them drip through every month, we're going to put them back so that you get a whole series of them that can be looked at on a quarterly basis. So that will allow you to make more informed decisions on whether or not you grant a larger award to an individual. You'll be able to see, well, what else have we had in this month? What's the demand in the last quarter? Sorry, and make that assessment. It's just it's important to have the flexibility so that if a particular worthy application comes in, that you've got the ability to say, okay, well, the requirement here is a slightly larger grant, because otherwise you won't be able to save the building. So as we talked about, St Luke's was a particularly difficult fix, because it was a very large building, it was a very significantly damaged building, and the repair costs were extremely high. So it's always important to remember that although it's a slightly larger grant, the expenditure by the owners of that building was enormous. So proportionally, it's actually a small grant.
Yeah. Thanks.
So it just gives us that flexibility.
Just a couple of quick things. On the table in 4.2, it would actually help to, I think, to make decisions if the percent or the amount or the percentage of the owner putting in. So the vicarage is a good example, whereas the overall cost of the restoration of the building is huge, and therefore, although this is a large amount, in the big picture of restoring the building, which is why we're doing this as the end game, is actually quite small, but it could be the game changer.
We'll add that improvement to future reports.
Yeah. And this building is going to be there for future generations, which is really what we're trying to achieve. The other the key question I've got is, I can see where my colleague is going to with this, but I guess a really clear memo or something of how capping this at whether it's 150 or whatever would affect, because if you look at this list just at 4.2, there are only 2 above it, but that does to me personally it's irrelevant. It's actually about the project, so they vary. So you've got variations of hardly anything really in the big picture things to significant, and how that will affect, and how capping it will affect future or your ability to do things.
Yeah. Well, we did discuss that in the workshop. If you remember that. Why would we not put a cap on?
Yeah,
and
but we're here at council and someone's put an amendment up. So I mean, it would be really good if all councillors could move forward with a really good understanding and agreement. That doesn't always happen every 26,000 years, maybe. But as we move forward, I think that would be quite helpful. I think personally.
We'll provide a memo to the chief executive that sets out the same information that was provided to the workshop.
Cool.
Thank you. I guess for me, like, I have the heritage incentive grants, I've got no problem with, but I want to see that spread around as much heritage properties as we can. And I find when we're doing $200,000 grants out of a pool of just over around 700,000, it quickly makes it disappear. Now, had we had this cap on it last year, we would have had another $100,000, which could have been another 1, 2, 3, 4 properties that could have had some good maintenance done to them. I personally feel that obviously this grant has moved away from trying to upkeep and maintain these heritage properties to actually restoring them back to what they were, which as a council we've got to say, where do we stop? You know, people are taking on these risks knowing the risks. They buy the properties knowing what needs to be done, and it shouldn't be up to council to give individuals $200,000 to finish the work off. I do 150,000, which I actually think is quite generous, just so it can get the full covenant. Quite frankly, I actually think it needs to be lower so we can actually make this heritage incentive grant spread even further. But I realise where the full covenant is. That's why I've gone for 150.
Well, you've moved it, the actual resolution. So I mean, you'll get the right of reply. So I'll end with you if that's all right, Andrew.
Yeah, I'm just listening to some of the debate here, and I'm feeling that we may have got some of the purpose of this a little bit confused. I mean, the grant is granted essentially for the purpose of a good outcome for the building, and who owns the building is kind of almost a less important matter. The reason these grants exist is to ensure good outcomes for heritage in the form of these buildings. And buildings change hands. Buildings may well have changed hands prior to the Heritage Incentive Grant taking place, and it frustrates me slightly that we're having the debate yet again on insurance proceeds, which we've heard when a number of these applications have been put through, application by application, and which clearly from the notes in the report was covered at the committee. It's the building, the nature of the building and the heritage in the form of the building which we're funding, not the owner. It just so happens the owner is the person who's made the commitment to a good outcome for that building. So I do think we probably need to look at this in terms of the outcomes we're trying to get, which is that heritage is retained, heritage is protected. There are buildings on the list that easily would have been lost had the Heritage Incentive Grant not been in place. And there are certainly restoration projects that wouldn't have been able to proceed without the assistance of the Heritage Incentive Grant. The policy settings around an upper limit on value, I would be very keen to see as much flexibility there as possible. If staff recommend, as they often do, an amount which is lower than 150,000, well, that's good advice, and we take that advice into account in making our decisions. If there are people around the table who have a view that anything over 150,000 is too much, well, that can be dealt with application by application. But on the merits of that application, rather than having a policy setting that may in fact be counterproductive to what this fund is all about, which is ensuring good outcomes for heritage buildings. And there are a couple on the list in front of us where the good outcome for the heritage building may in fact not have been able to occur had we been looking at a $150,000 cap. We also need to bear in mind that the total amount of funding that we put on budget for these grants is a matter for the LTP rather than something that we would be looking at as a matter of policy or application by application. And as we do with a number of funds, how we graduate the flow of funds over the LTP year, the annual plan year, is something that we would be taking into account, looking at what's left in the pot as we decide on individual grant applications. So I think a lot of what's been discussed here in terms of the upper cap can be dealt with application by application and on good staff recommendation each time. But I'm pleased to see the policy settings on this finally resolved so that hopefully we don't need to debate these matters every time an application comes in front of us.
Good. Sarah?
Thank you. I agree with much of what's been said actually from even the differing points of view here. And I'd like to address something slightly new that I talked about briefly earlier, was that there's the carryover. We're in really tight financial times, and while we value the heritage fabric of our city and we want to help maintain it, if there isn't the call on that resource in any one year. I don't believe that we should have a carryover into the next year. So I'll be asking to put number 4 separately. It's operational funding that's going to buildings which people may not see, but actually there's a protection in here, because now that we're shifting to quarterly considering of these rather than monthly, the committee will be able to, in its last quarterly section, be able to, if it chooses, divvy up the full amount between those properties without having to look for the carryover anyway. So there is a protection. The funding could be used, but if it's not, if there is no call for it in any one year, we shouldn't be putting extra financial strain on our budget when that could be used to fix other things which take up our operational money, like potholes and roads, which is one of the biggest things we hear about. And I would much rather that the funding went into that than uncalled for in heritage.
Glenn, and then.
Thank you. I totally hear that call on restraint on the ratepayer spending. That's a legitimate view. I acknowledge that. Just a few points here. It's evident on our visits around the heritage buildings that they are all different. So no two buildings are the same. They all wear differently, they're aged differently, constructed of different materials. So it really is, I think, as Councillor Turner said, on its merits or its situational. My concern would be that if we put a cap here, we could potentially jeopardise the saving of the buildings. 150, I know there's a round figure, we often do that. Just a bit arbitrary though, is kind of a blanket figure across all the buildings. So I would urge you to stay with the status quo. Over the risks, the same risks are apparent in our public buildings. If we take the Rose Chapel, for instance, water egress was discovered in some of the lining. You know, this has all been public further down the track. So you do get these cost blowouts, which you have to allow for with your contingency budget. And if you put a cap on that, that has the knock-on effect of reducing the contingency amount as well. So yeah, I would urge you really to stay with what we're doing at the moment.
Thank you. Phil?
So look, councillors, I think this is a case of being careful you don't get what you wish for. Like, for example, the suggestion that in fact the request that we vote against having the funds carried over. It's not a large amount, but it can make quite a difference. There's precedent for this, of course, strengthening communities. Community boards are able to carry their funding over. So where does a kind of like penny pinching begin and where does it end? It doesn't mean that it's not important that we watch the funding carefully. But I think altogether, like this, the whole objective of the heritage grants needs to be kept in mind. And that is to protect and at times, yes, restore our heritage if we're going to have it. We want our city to be tourism friendly. We want it to be visitor friendly. We have to support that happens. And there may be some cases where, yes, a figure of above 150,000 will make a huge difference. As Deputy Mayor has said, those matters will come back to council. And so I think, like, if we decide to take away the flexibility of something which is expensive like heritage, well, we're really cutting our noses off to spite our faces in terms of, I think, the future growth and development of our city, which we are all proud of.
Thank you. All right, I'll put the amendment first. Those in favour say aye. Those opposed say no. No. That's lost. So I'll record those who voted for the amendment. Sarah Templeton, Mike Davidson, Yanni Johansson. I'll put item 4. Those in favour say aye. Well, yeah, it's to approve the request to allow unallocated sums be carried over. No, we're not voting to take it out. We're voting. I've been asked to put it separately, and that's what I'm doing. So I'll put it again. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Hands up for those opposed. So David East, Sarah Templeton, Mike Davidson, Tim scanned it. Hey? So Sarah, Mike and Tim, that's carried. And I'll put the other three, all those in favour say aye. Those opposed say no. That's carried. Thank you.